No one believed it. They shrugged, laughed, and said, "It's just another date." But something about October 17th felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath. A strange stillness covered the world, quiet yet heavy, as if heaven was watching, waiting. Some people felt an unexplainable pull in their spirit. Others had dreams that felt more like warnings than coincidences. Yet still, no one listened, because divine signs rarely shout. They whisper. They echo softly through the soul, reaching only those who are tuned to the right frequency. And on that day, the whisper became a storm in silence, a warning wrapped in peace, missed by almost everyone. What really happened on October 17th? And why did so many feel the shift, that quiet trembling between the physical and the spiritual, while others walked through the day as if nothing had changed? The whisper before the storm. There are moments in history when heaven leans closer, not to speak through thunder or fire, but through a still, almost invisible whisper. Before October 17th, that whisper moved quietly across hearts and nations. A mother in Argentina woke from a dream of crimson skies. A pastor in Brazil couldn't shake the feeling that something was approaching, something divine yet unsettling. In small corners of the world, believers prayed, fasted, and felt a weight in their spirits. A call that few could describe and even fewer dared to share. The world kept spinning, of course. Markets opened, people rushed to work, phones buzzed with meaningless noise. No one had time for prophecy anymore, not in an age of algorithms and distractions. Yet somewhere beneath the static there was a pulse, a rhythm only discernible to those attuned to it. The scriptures had warned about moments like this. He who has ears, let him hear. Matthew 11:15. But who listens now, when the divine no longer trends? In Jerusalem, a man stood near the western wall that week, whispering an old prayer for mercy. He said later that the wind shifted, warm then cold, like the breath of something eternal passing by. Across the ocean, in a small church in Texas, a young woman wept during worship for no apparent reason. It felt like the Spirit was mourning, she said. These fragments, scattered and ignored, were threads in a tapestry God was quietly weaving, a divine pattern that human eyes refused to see. There's a strange irony in how warnings arrive. They rarely come with titles, never with special effects. Sometimes they slip into our dreams or hide in moments of silence so pure they almost hurt. The prophets of old knew that pain, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, men who spoke truth no one wanted to hear. They weren't alarmists. They were messengers carrying burdens too heavy for applause. Maybe that's why so many today choose comfort over conviction. It's easier to mock what you don't understand than to kneel before what you fear might be true. And so, October 17th came like any other day. Sunlight breaking through clouds, laughter echoing in cafes, headlines full of everything but the truth. Yet beneath the surface, heaven trembled. It was as if creation itself was holding its breath, waiting for humanity to notice. Those who had prayed felt the shift instantly, a deep, almost electric awareness that something had changed in the unseen. But the world? The world kept scrolling, the silence that followed. After the whispers faded, silence took over. Not the peaceful kind that soothes the soul, but a heavy, suffocating quiet. The kind that makes the air feel thick, as if creation itself were waiting for permission to breathe again. On October 18th, the sun rose just as it always did. But to those who had felt something stirring before, the light seemed colder, paler. There was a strange tension, invisible yet palpable, like a held note that refused to resolve. Even nature, some said, seemed to hesitate. It was then that reflection began. People who had dismissed the warnings found themselves haunted by unease. A teacher in Mexico confessed that her morning prayer felt different, as though the heavens had moved slightly farther away. A fisherman on the coast of Chile swore the sea looked darker, heavier than usual. And far from them, a preacher reread the book of Joel. The day of the Lord is great. It is dreadful. Who can endure it? The verse echoed in his mind like thunder that never quite broke. Humanity has always struggled with silence. We crave noise, distraction, motion, anything that keeps us from facing what might lie beyond the veil. Yet in that global stillness, something sacred was at work. God was not absent. He was listening, testing, measuring hearts, perhaps, to see who would trust him even when the signs stopped. Faith is rarely proven in miracles. It's proven in the waiting, when heaven feels quiet and your prayers echo back unanswered. A few discerned it. In private prayer rooms, in lonely walks, in the soft ache of unanswered questions, they sensed a call to repentance. Not the loud, performative kind, but one born in humility. Be still and know that I am God, Psalm 46:10. Those words took on a new weight. The silence wasn't punishment. It was an invitation. The Creator, like a patient father, had withdrawn his voice not in anger, but to remind his children how to listen again. And so, the world entered a fragile calm. People carried on, unaware they were walking on the edge of something eternal. The faithful kept praying, though the answers came slower. Others, unbothered, buried themselves deeper in their routines, unaware that the silence itself was a message, a pause before revelation, a divine breath before the next storm. The day after October 17th wasn't the end of the warning. It was the beginning of understanding what had been spoken all along, the signs in the sky. It began subtly, the kind of phenomenon skeptics call coincidence and believers call confirmation. A ring of light appeared over the Andes at dusk, not fiery or violent, but impossibly pure, suspended against a fading crimson sky. Videos flooded social media, dismissed as atmospheric illusion, yet those who had prayed through October 17th knew it wasn't random. Something ancient was speaking through nature, as if the heavens were painting parables across the sky for anyone with eyes to see. In Scripture, the sky has always been God's canvas. From the star that led wise men to Bethlehem to the darkened sun that marked the death of Christ, the firmament has never been silent. And now, millennia later, it seemed to whisper again, "Look up." People around the world began noticing strange alignments. 3 planets forming a perfect line, a comet visible longer than predicted, a moon glowing redder than science could explain, patterns, echoes, reminders that creation itself still bends to the Creator's will. News anchors joked about it. Influencers turned it into memes. But somewhere in Israel, an old rabbi wept as he watched the twilight deepen. "This," he whispered, "is not random. This is a reminder." His words carried no fame, no following, but they carried truth, that the world had grown too clever for its own good. We explain everything, label everything, dissect everything, until there's nothing left sacred. But that week, even the unbelievers paused for a moment longer than usual when they looked at the stars. Prophets from centuries past would have recognized it instantly. The same pulse that stirred before floods, before Exodus, before Revelation, that tension between warning and wonder. And yet, unlike those ancient times, humanity now had the arrogance of technology. We hold the world in our hands, but cannot discern the heavens above us. While the signs glimmered in plain sight, hearts remained dimmed by distraction. It was never about astronomy. It was about awareness, and still, amid the skepticism, a quiet revival began. Churches reopened their doors for midnight prayers. Strangers gathered in parks, lifting their hands under the open sky, weeping without understanding why. It wasn't fear that drew them. It was recognition, the soul's instinctive response to the divine. The signs in the sky were never meant to terrify. They were an invitation, a reminder that heaven still speaks and that silence too is part of God's voice. The voice in the wilderness. As the signs above grew stronger, a stirring began below. In the deserts of Jordan, a man with nothing to lose began preaching beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. His voice was raw, his message unpolished, yet something in his tone carried an ancient authority. "Repent," he said, "for the time is near when hearts will be weighed and mercy will no longer wait." People laughed at first, the way they laughed at prophets before him. But the laughter didn't last long. There was something unsettling about his calm, something too sure to ignore. He wasn't the only one. In remote villages, on online platforms, in crowded cities, others began echoing the same message, different tongues, same urgency. They didn't know each other, yet their words harmonized like verses from one unseen script. A woman in Peru woke from a dream repeating, "Prepare the way." A pastor in Kenya heard the same phrase while praying for rain. It was as if heaven was broadcasting through broken transmitters, calling out to anyone still listening through the static of the world. But not everyone welcomed the message. The wilderness has always been a lonely place for truth. Those who dared to speak found themselves mocked, silenced, or conveniently forgotten. Prophets, it seems, have expiration dates in the modern age. Their words fade the moment the algorithm moves on. And yet, those who heard them couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't mere hysteria. There was weight to it, like a storm pressing on the chest, invisible but impossible to deny. The man in Jordan disappeared after his final sermon. Witnesses said he looked up, smiled, and simply walked into the dust, as if answering a call the rest couldn't hear. His followers were left confused, but the echo of his final words remained. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, "Make straight the path of the Lord." That verse from Isaiah had been repeated for centuries, yet suddenly it felt alive again, relevant, urgent, personal. The wilderness wasn't a place anymore. It was the world itself, a place stripped of meaning, parched for truth, drowning in noise. And God once again was speaking through the unlikeliest of voices. Maybe that's why so few recognized it. Heaven doesn't compete with entertainment. It whispers in the wind, waiting for those willing to stop. Listen and believe that sometimes prophecy doesn't come to warn. It comes to awaken, the awakening of the few. While the world mocked, a quiet awakening began, small, unseen, but powerful. It didn't start in cathedrals or television pulpits. It started in bedrooms, in whispered prayers before dawn, in the silent tears of those who couldn't explain what they were feeling. Across continents, believers who had never met began sharing the same dreams, the same verses, the same unmistakable pull to seek God with urgency. It wasn't panic, it was clarity. Something was stirring in the spirit realm, and those who were listening could feel it, like a tremor beneath their ribs. One woman in Colombia wrote that she woke every night at 3:17 a.m., the exact hour she later found written in Jeremiah 3:17, "At the time they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all nations will gather to it." She didn't understand the full meaning, but she knew it wasn't random. Across the ocean, a young man in Seoul heard a voice in prayer whisper, "Watch the nations, for I am shifting the balance." These weren't coincidences. They were coordinates, divine signals, awakening a remnant who refused to sleep through the storm. Those who woke up spiritually began to see the world differently. Headlines felt prophetic. Politics, weather, technology, everything seemed charged with deeper meaning. The mundane turned symbolic. Even small acts, like helping a stranger or forgiving an old wound, carried eternal weight. It wasn't paranoia. It was perception. The Holy Spirit was sharpening their discernment, teaching them that not every shaking is destruction. Sometimes it's preparation. As Jesus said, "When these things begin to happen, stand up and lift your heads because your redemption is drawing near." Luke 21:28. But awakening always comes with a cost. The awakened found themselves misunderstood, even isolated. Friends rolled their eyes. Family members called them dramatic. They were labeled conspiracy theorists, religious fanatics, end times dreamers. Yet deep down, these souls knew they were hearing something real, something urgent. Faith doesn't need validation. It needs obedience. So they prayed harder, fasted longer, and waited, not for chaos, but for confirmation. And in that waiting, a light began to form. Not a physical one, but a spiritual illumination. A realization that awakening wasn't about fear. It was about alignment. God wasn't sending panic. He was sending purpose. The few who woke up started walking differently, speaking differently, loving differently. Their prayers grew bolder, their hearts quieter. They realized this was never about predicting a date, it was about preparing a generation. And though the world kept sleeping, heaven was wide awake, the tremor beneath the nations. While the awakened prayed, the earth began to respond. Not metaphorically, literally. In the weeks that followed October 17th, tremors rippled through regions long thought stable. Political alliances fractured overnight, economies wavered, and old rivalries reignited like embers catching wind. Scientists blamed climate policy chance, but those who had been listening knew better. The shaking wasn't chaos, it was calibration. God was rearranging the stage of history, forcing nations to face what they had long ignored, the weight of spiritual imbalance. Across Europe, leaders held secret meetings, uneasy about coincidences that didn't fit their reports. In the Middle East, strange cloud formations appeared over deserts where no rain had fallen for decades. And in the Pacific, storms formed faster than satellites could predict. The headlines called it a year of anomalies, but prophets called it fulfillment, a fulfillment written long ago. I will once more shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Hebrews 12:26. That verse, once symbolic, had begun to feel like breaking news. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of the world, believers gathered not to protest, but to intercede. They saw what others didn't, that every tremor in the natural mirrored a tremor in the spiritual. When economies shook, hearts shook. When nations panicked, faith was tested. A group in Nigeria prayed through the night for mercy. In Ukraine, a pastor led a small congregation underground, reading Psalm 46 aloud. Though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, we will not fear. Their courage wasn't denial, it was defiance, the kind born only from conviction. Governments searched for explanations. Analysts searched for patterns. None could predict the convergence building beneath it all, a chain reaction of both natural and supernatural proportions. The tremor wasn't a punishment, it was a summons. God was stirring humanity awake, not to destroy, but to reorient. Yet the pride of nations, like Pharaoh's heart, hardened with every warning. And just like Egypt before the Exodus, the world was about to discover that ignoring divine rhythm comes at a cost. Still, amid the tension, mercy lingered. The Spirit whispered to those willing to hear, "Do not be afraid." These are the birth pains, not the end. Faithful men and women clung to that promise, choosing prayer over panic. And though the tremors continued, shaking systems, exposing corruption, revealing hidden truths, the faithful understood one thing: before revival, there is always a shaking. Before awakening, there is always a tremor beneath the nations, the division of belief. As the tremors spread and signs multiplied, humanity began to fracture, not just politically or culturally, but spiritually. The line between belief and disbelief became sharper than ever before. In one house, a mother prayed while her son mocked her faith. In another, a husband fasted while his wife scrolled through the news, convinced the world was simply having a rough season. Conversations turned into debates, and debates into silence. Faith, once a private comfort, had become a public battlefield. Churches filled and emptied in waves. Some came seeking answers, others came to argue. There were preachers proclaiming revival, and others preaching reason, dismissing prophecy as hysteria. Yet behind every pulpit, behind every post, a deeper tension pulsed. Fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being right. Even within the faithful, questions festered. If God is speaking, why does he remain so silent? If he warned us, why won't he explain? These weren't words of rebellion. They were words of exhaustion, the kind that echo in every generation before revelation breaks. And still, the divide grew. Communities that once worshipped together found themselves split down in visible lines. Some heard confirmation in every lightning strike, every headline. Others demanded proof, charts, data. The world was caught between two frequencies, heaven's whisper and earth's noise, and both seemed deafening. The Spirit was still moving, but few could agree on what he was saying. The book of Amos described it long ago. "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord." That famine had arrived. In the midst of this division, those who stood firm did so quietly. They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They prayed. A small church in Brazil began nightly vigils, not to predict the future, but to surrender to it. A community in South Korea met in basements, reading psalms in whispers so gentle they sounded like breathing. Their faith wasn't blind, it was anchored. They didn't claim to know what God would do next. They simply refused to stop believing that he would. Meanwhile, skepticism hardened into cynicism. The more God seemed to move, the more people mocked those who noticed. "Where is your proof?" they asked. "Where is your God?" The same questions had echoed at the foot of the cross, and still they echo now. But in that tension, something unexpected happened. Faith began to purify itself. It shed the noise, the showmanship, the ego. What remained was raw, unfiltered belief, not loud, not glamorous, but alive. And as the world argued, heaven prepared for what was coming next. The breaking point. There comes a moment when silence can no longer contain truth. The world had reached that moment. The air itself felt charged, like a storm that had been circling for too long, finally deciding where to strike. Economies faltered, cities trembled, and tempers flared. But beyond the chaos of headlines and politics, something deeper broke, the illusion of control. Humanity, for all its brilliance, was beginning to understand that no technology, no empire, no philosophy could steady a planet shaking under the weight of divine timing. It began one night with a blackout, not in one country, but across continents. Power grids failed without explanation. For hours, half the world stood in literal darkness. People poured into the streets, staring at the sky as unfamiliar constellations glimmered above them, bright, sharp, impossibly close. Some said they heard a sound, a hum like distant thunder, or a great heartbeat echoing from the heavens. Others said it was nothing but imagination. But those who had been awake in spirit knew exactly what it was. It wasn't fear they felt, it was recognition. The Creator was near. In that darkness, everything superficial fell away. Families huddled together, strangers shared candles, and atheists whispered prayers they never thought they'd say. The proud became small, the forgotten became seen, and somewhere in that global stillness, something ancient and merciful passed over humanity. Not wrath, not destruction, but a holy confrontation. Like when Elijah stood before the mountain, and God's voice came not in the wind, nor the earthquake, nor the fire, but in a whisper so powerful it shattered his pride. This was that whisper stretched across the earth. For some, the breaking point was despair. For others, it was deliverance. A soldier in Ukraine fell to his knees mid-battle, overcome by a peace that defied logic. A woman in Los Angeles, trapped in traffic during the blackout, suddenly felt compelled to forgive the father she hadn't spoken to in decades. These weren't coincidences, they were conversions. God was breaking hearts not to harm them, but to heal them. The world had been deaf for too long, and now heaven had raised its voice. When the lights finally returned, the world looked the same, but it wasn't. Something unseen had shifted. Those who had scoffed now felt uneasy, and those who had believed felt strengthened. The divide of belief had reached its edge, and the next phase was no longer about warnings, it was about decisions. The breaking point wasn't an ending, it was an invitation. The kind of moment when heaven bends low and asks softly, "Now that you've seen, will you listen?" The unveiling. After the breaking came the clarity. It didn't arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with stillness. A strange, weightless calm that followed weeks of tension. The world expected catastrophe. What it received was revelation. Governments resumed their order, people returned to their routines, yet something invisible hung in the atmosphere. An awareness, like the hush before dawn, when light is seconds away. The prophets called it the unveiling. For the first time, humanity was beginning to see, not just look. It started with testimonies. Ordinary people, farmers, nurses, teachers, soldiers, began sharing dreams that aligned without ever meeting. Visions of the same moment, the sky opening, a voice speaking not in words, but in understanding. "Do not fear," it said, "for I am still with you." Those who heard it described an overwhelming peace, the kind that doesn't make sense, the kind that makes you cry without knowing why. It wasn't global hysteria, it was global awareness. The Creator had made contact not through disaster, but through the renewal of perception. Scholars dismissed it as mass psychology. Media moved on, but for millions, the change was irreversible. They began to see divine patterns in the everyday, not superstition, but synchronization. The right person calling at the right moment. The needed job arriving, the weak faith was rekindled. The verse on a stranger's post that answered a silent prayer. Coincidence had lost its meaning. It was revelation in motion. God was teaching a distracted generation how to notice again. The unveiling also exposed darkness, not new evil, but hidden evil. Corruption, exploitation, deceit that had lingered in shadows for decades came crashing into the light. What had been whispered behind closed doors now shouted across the earth. Leaders fell, systems crumbled, and through it all, a strange justice began to unfold. Not human justice, but divine equilibrium. The scales were being balanced, just as Daniel had foretold. For everything hidden shall be revealed. Luke 8:17. The truth had never been absent. It had only been waiting for eyes that could see. Those who were awake realized this was the real warning all along. October 17th hadn't been about destruction. It was about disclosure. Humanity had been given a glimpse behind the veil. The storms, the tremors, the silence, all of it was preparation for this moment of spiritual unveiling, when what was concealed in heaven would begin to echo on earth. The message was simple, yet terrifying in its clarity. The time of ignorance had ended, and the age of awareness had begun, the response of humanity. When truth revealed itself, the world didn't celebrate. It hesitated. Humanity, stripped of excuses, faced the one thing it feared most: accountability. The unveiling had exposed what lay beneath progress: greed disguised as ambition, comfort mistaken for peace, noise posing as purpose. Some fell to their knees, humbled by recognition. Others clenched their fists, desperate to hold on to the illusion that control was still theirs. It wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of pretending. And for many, that was far more terrifying. In cities and villages alike, something extraordinary began to unfold. Two movements rising in opposite directions. One sought repentance, the other rebellion. Prayer gatherings multiplied in quiet corners of the world, while protests erupted in others. Some begged for mercy, others demanded proof. The line between the sacred and the secular blurred as human emotion flooded the global stage. Grief, awe, denial, defiance, all swirling together like a storm of souls caught between two realities, heaven's truth and earth's pride. A pastor in Lagos preached to thousands under an open sky, shouting above the wind, "This is not judgment, it's mercy disguised as awakening." At the same hour, in New York, a scientist stood before the media declaring humanity will define its own destiny. Both believed they were right. Both carried conviction. And perhaps in their own ways, both were answering the same divine question. When light comes, will you shield your eyes or walk toward it? The world had been given sight. Now it had to choose what to see. For the humble, the choice was simple. They let go. They surrendered the illusion of certainty and rediscovered faith not as doctrine, but as relationship. They started forgiving, serving, building again, not from fear, but from revelation. These people didn't claim to understand everything. They just knew something holy was happening. The Spirit wasn't punishing, He was inviting. And those who accepted the invitation began to glow from within. Their peace contagious, their joy unexplainable. Revival wasn't a service, It was a posture, but resistance grew just as fiercely. Governments debated control. Philosophers called it manipulation. Some even attempted to recreate the phenomena artificially, to counterfeit the divine. Yet no simulation could reproduce the presence they denied. It wasn't science they were fighting. It was surrender. Humanity had reached the oldest crossroads known to creation, the same one faced by Adam, by Israel, by every soul ever touched by truth. Will you yield, or will you rebel? And so the world stood trembling between two voices, one whispering redemption, the other promising independence. One led to peace, the other to pride. The great unveiling had done its work. It had exposed not just the heart of nations, but the heart of man. What came next would not be decided by prophecy or politics, but by choice, the stirring of the heavens. The night sky had never looked so alive. Stars that once seemed fixed began to shimmer with a strange intensity, as if something behind them was pressing through. Astronomers spoke of magnetic shifts and solar anomalies. Prophets spoke of alignment. Whatever it was, it felt orchestrated. The universe, long silent, had started to move again, and with every pulse of light across the heavens, hearts on earth felt the echo, a faint vibration, ancient yet familiar, like the first notes of a forgotten song. Those attuned to the Spirit said they could feel it before they could see it. Prayer groups around the world began reporting the same sensation, a sudden warmth, a quickening heartbeat, the overwhelming urge to look upward. "Something is awakening," whispered an old monk in Greece. His words traveled faster than the wind, reaching believers in every language, every time zone. The veil between the visible and the invisible was thinning, and creation itself seemed to be leaning closer to listen. In Revelation, John had written that heaven would open like a scroll. Now people wondered if this was the beginning of that unfolding. Clouds shaped themselves into spirals that defied logic. Colors rippled across horizons where none should exist. Cameras captured it, skeptics mocked it, but even cynics couldn't deny the awe. For the first time, science and faith stood side by side, staring into mystery, both humbled by what neither could explain. The same data that fed disbelief was now feeding curiosity. Perhaps somewhere in the noise, truth had found a way to speak through both. And in the midst of cosmic wonder, whispers of prophecy grew louder. "He is not coming to destroy," said one preacher. "He is coming through the awakening of his people." The words resonated, spreading like sparks across dry fields. This was not the apocalypse of fire. It was the dawn of awareness. The stars themselves seemed to bear witness, shimmering in rhythm with prayers rising from the earth. What had once been viewed as separate, heaven above, humanity below, now felt like one intertwined breath. But not all looked upward with hope. Some felt dread, fearing what revelation might bring. The same signs that inspired faith also provoked rebellion. Governments raced to control the narrative. Scientists competed for theories. Philosophers debated meaning. Yet above all arguments, one truth remained. Heaven was moving, and nothing could stop it. The stirring wasn't a spectacle for entertainment. It was a summons. And in that vast, trembling silence between stars, creation waited for humanity's final answer, the descent of purpose. Then it happened, quiet at first, almost imperceptible. The same skies that had trembled began to pour out light, not as a beam, but as presence. It didn't fall like rain or thunder. It descended like breath, slow, deliberate, intelligent. Those who saw it said the air thickened with warmth, with love so tangible it made them weep. Cities, mountains, oceans, all were touched by a glow that seemed to seep from within creation itself. It wasn't another warning. It was purpose returning home. In that hour, humanity felt something it hadn't felt in centuries: alignment. Not peace through politics or treaties, but the kind that comes when the Creator and creation remember each other. The faithful felt it first, a surge of clarity, as though their spirits finally exhaled after holding breath too long. They spoke softly, their words carrying strange weight. "He's not just above us," one child said. "He's among us." No one could explain how the child knew, but every heart nearby agreed. purpose began to manifest in the smallest ways. A nurse in Paris suddenly felt compelled to pray over every patient. A farmer in Kenya harvested twice what he sowed. A musician in Seoul played a melody he swore he'd never learned, yet the room filled with peace when he did. It wasn't coincidence, it was coordination. The Spirit was moving through human hands, reawakening creativity, compassion, and courage. Heaven had not invaded, it had partnered. The world was witnessing what the prophets meant when they said, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." But light always exposes, and purpose is never painless. Those who resisted began to feel the weight of their own dissonance, the gnawing discomfort of running from truth that no longer hid. Technology faltered. Ambition lost its charm. Power structures built on greed began to collapse under their own emptiness. It wasn't punishment, it was purification. The divine purpose descending wasn't destroying the world. It was remaking it from the inside out, one willing heart at a time, and through it all there was a sound, faint but undeniable, a hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Some called it music, others vibration, but the faithful called it what it truly was: worship. The earth was responding. Oceans roared softer, winds shifted course. Even the stars seemed to pulse in time. The Creator's hand had not only returned, it was guiding. And as heaven's purpose met human will, history began to tilt, not toward an ending, but toward a beginning that felt holy enough to break you just to heal you again. The restoration, and then something in the atmosphere shifted, not violently, not with fire, but like a wound beginning to close. Where once there had been trembling, now there was tenderness. Where division had festered, now reconciliation gently took root. It didn't sweep the earth with noise or spectacle. It came like the morning, slow, faithful, unstoppable. The restoration had begun. It started in hearts. Not governments, not institutions, but individual souls. A woman in Berlin walked into a church she hadn't entered in 20 years. She didn't speak. She just stood there and wept. A former gang leader in São Paulo dropped to his knees mid-sentence and began praying in a language he didn't know. In Tokyo, a businessman who had lived for nothing but profit donated his entire fortune to rebuild orphanages. These stories weren't headlines, but they were holy, quiet miracles. The kind that don't shout, they whisper eternity. The Spirit began restoring what trauma had broken. Families estranged for decades found themselves sitting at the same table, not with words, but with tears. Marriages on the brink of collapse rediscovered forgiveness. Even within nations, enemies began to reach across lines that once felt carved in stone. It wasn't utopia, it was healing. And healing, unlike hype, requires courage. The courage to let go of pain that had defined you for too long. The courage to let God redefine what seemed beyond repair. Scripture calls God the restorer of the breach, Isaiah 58:12. And now, across the earth, breaches were being mended. Between generations, between faith and doubt, between humanity and the divine. But this restoration wasn't just horizontal, it was vertical. People began to seek God not out of fear, but longing. The prayers changed. No longer help me escape, but Lord, help me align. Revival had matured into restoration, not merely emotion, but transformation, and through it all, joy began to return. Not surface happiness, but the kind of joy that wells up from somewhere eternal, the kind that makes you smile through tears, the kind that anchors your soul even when storms still rage outside. People sang again, children danced in the streets again, and heaven? Heaven wasn't distant anymore. It was near. Near enough to feel, near enough to change everything. The God who warned had returned not with wrath, but with restoration. There is always a final moment, a breath held at the edge of time, a heartbeat before the curtain closes. And now the world stands in that space. The signs have come, the heavens have stirred, the hearts of many have awakened. But the question still hangs in the air, not for nations, not for crowds, for you. The final call is not to the earth, it is to the soul, yours. This was never about a date. Not really. October 17th wasn't a deadline. It was a doorway, a point on the timeline of eternity where God gently placed his hand and said, "Look again." And some did, some heard. Some wept, but many still walked away. Not out of hatred, not out of habit, out of fear, out of comfort. The enemy of destiny was never darkness. It was distraction. So now heaven asks one last time, where is your heart? Not your performance, not your opinion, your heart. Have you returned to the one who formed it? Or are you still clinging to a world that is quietly fading? These aren't questions meant to shame. They are questions meant to save. Because the mercy of God doesn't shout to condemn, it whispers to invite, and maybe that's why you're still listening. Not by accident, not by curiosity, but because deep down, something in you knows this message was always for you. The pull you've felt, that ache, that tension, that stirring in the quiet, it wasn't random. It was the Father calling his children home, one by one, heart by heart. No stage, no spotlight, just him and you. Choose this day whom you will serve. Joshua 24:15. That verse isn't ancient. It's now. You've seen the signs. You've heard the warnings. You've witnessed the restoration. Now the final call isn't a prophecy. It's a choice. Will you ignore it or answer? Will you watch or will you rise? The door is still open, but it won't stay open forever. Sometimes the loudest warnings come in silence, and sometimes the greatest acts of mercy don't feel like miracles. They feel like choices. That's what this journey has been. Not just a revelation of what happened on October 17th, but a mirror showing us what still can. The question is no longer if God spoke. The question is, did we listen? You've heard the signs. You've walked through the shaking. You felt the tension between awakening and apathy. So now what will you do with it? Because this wasn't just a story, it was a summons. And sometimes the final call isn't to the world. It's to one person. If this message stirred something in you, even if it was just a question, don't let it fade. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what part of this story felt like it was speaking directly to you? I want to hear from you, really. And if you're still holding your breath after everything you've seen, wait until you see what's coming next. The next chapter isn't speculation, it's fulfillment.